Way back in the early 2000s, life seemed normal on the surface. My wife and I had been married for nearly a decade, and we had two beautiful children, a son who was 6 and a daughter who was 4. They were the center of our world, and for the most part, our lives revolved around them. My wife worked a part-time job a few days a week, and I had a steady 9-to-5 that paid the bills. We weren't rich, but we were comfortable, or so I thought. It all started with a nagging feeling, a gut instinct that something was off. My wife had always been a loving mother and a supportive partner, but over time I began to notice subtle changes in her behavior. She seemed more distant, more preoccupied. At first I chalked it up to stress or fatigue. Raising 2 young kids while juggling work and household responsibilities was no easy feat. But as the weeks went by, the feeling that something was wrong only grew stronger. The first red flag came when our kids started mentioning how much fun they had at their grandparents' house. My wife's parents lived about 90 minutes away, and while it wasn't unusual for them to visit occasionally, the frequency of these trips raised my suspicions. According to the kids, they were staying there 2 or 3 times a week. That seemed excessive, especially since my wife only worked part-time. What was she doing on those days when she wasn't at work? When I asked her about it, she brushed it off, saying the kids loved spending time with their grandparents and that it gave her a chance to run errands or have some time to herself. Her explanation made sense, but something about her tone and body language didn't sit right with me. She had never been a good liar, and I could tell she was hiding something. Determined to get to the bottom of it, I started tracking the mileage on her car. I kept a small notebook in the glove compartment and made a note of the odometer reading every time she left the house. After a few weeks, the numbers didn't add up. She was driving an extra 400 miles or so every week, far more than what a trip to her parents' house and back would account for. My suspicions deepened. Where was she going all those miles? One evening, I sat down at our shared computer to check my email. As I reached for the keyboard, I noticed a sticky note stuck to the desk. It had my wife's AOL username and password written on it in her neat handwriting. My heart raced. I knew I shouldn't invade her privacy, but the temptation was too strong. I logged into her account and began scrolling through her emails. It didn't take long to find what I was looking for. There, in black and white, were email exchanges between my wife and her college best friend. The messages were explicit and devastating. My wife had been having an affair with one of her ex-boyfriends from high school. They had reconnected at a class reunion a few months earlier, and things had escalated from there. The emails were filled with details about their secret meetings, their plans to deceive their spouses, and even cruel comments about the other man's wife. My wife mocked her for gaining weight after having kids, calling her pathetic and lazy. Reading those words felt like a punch to the gut. This wasn't the woman I thought I knew. I printed out the emails and stashed them in a folder, unsure of what to do next. Part of me wanted to confront her immediately, but I knew I needed more evidence. I needed to know the full extent of what was going on. A few days later, I called an old friend who was a cop. I explained the situation, and he suggested I hire a private investigator. He gave me the number of a guy named Ron, who had left the force to start his own PI business. Ron was a no-nonsense kind of guy, and after meeting with him, I felt confident he could get me the answers I needed. I paid Ron's retainer and handed over the emails and any other information I had about my wife's activities. He got to work immediately, and within a couple of weeks, he had compiled a detailed report. It included photos, timestamps, and locations that confirmed my worst fears. According to Ron's findings, my wife would drop the kids off at her parents' house, then meet her ex-boyfriend for lunch at a small diner on the outskirts of town. Afterward, they would check into a cheap motel and spend a few hours together before she picked up the kids and returned home. The report was thorough and damning, leaving no room for doubt. Reading Ron's report was one of the hardest things I've ever done. I felt a mix of anger, betrayal, and sadness. My parents had cheated on each other when I was a kid, and the fallout had destroyed our family. I had vowed never to let that happen to my own children, but here I was, facing the same situation. I knew I couldn't stay in the marriage. Trust had been broken, and there was no going back. I hired a divorce lawyer and began the process of ending our marriage. But before I filed the papers, I wanted to know more about the man my wife had been seeing. I asked Ron to dig into the ex-boyfriend's background. His name was Bob, and he was married with 3 kids. He worked as a vice president of sales at his father-in-law's company, which explained why he had the flexibility to meet my wife during the day. Ron's investigation revealed that Bob's wife had no idea about the affair. She seemed like a decent person, and I couldn't help but feel sorry for her. On the day I had my wife served with divorce papers at her workplace, I also arranged for Ron to meet with Bob's wife. He showed her the evidence of her husband's infidelity, and from what I heard, she was devastated but grateful to know the truth. What she did with that information was up to her, but I felt it was only fair that she knew what was going on. The divorce proceedings were relatively straightforward. My wife didn't contest it, and we agreed to shared custody of the kids. While her infidelity didn't have a significant impact on the legal outcome, it did affect our relationship. We remained civil for the sake of the children, but the trust between us was gone. As for Bob, his life unraveled completely. His wife cleaned out their joint bank account, took the kids, and left him. When her father found out about the affair, Bob was fired from his job. Since the house they lived in was owned by her parents, he was also evicted. Their divorce was messy and public, with restraining orders, police reports, and even a physical altercation that left Bob with a broken nose. I lost track of Bob after that. Last I heard, he had moved out of state and was trying to start over. His ex-wife, on the other hand, seemed to be doing well. She went to work for her father's company and eventually took over when he retired. For years after the divorce, I focused on rebuilding my life. My kids became my anchor, and I poured all my energy into being the best father I could be. My ex-wife and I managed to co-parent without too much drama, though our interactions were always strained, like 2 strangers forced to share a life they no longer recognized. I didn't hate her. Hate felt too exhausting, but I also didn't forgive her. Forgiveness, I told myself, was something I'd get to someday, maybe when the scars didn't feel so fresh. But life has a funny way of throwing curveballs when you least expect them. A decade after the divorce, my daughter, now in her early 20s, called me one evening. Her voice was shaky, and I could tell something was wrong. "Dad," she said, "I need to tell you something. It's about Mom." My stomach dropped. I hadn't spoken to my ex-wife in years, and the thought of her still stirred up a mix of emotions I'd tried to bury. "What is it?" I asked, bracing myself. "She's sick, Dad. Really sick. It's cancer." The words hit me like a freight train. I didn't know what to say. My ex-wife had always been the picture of health, vibrant, energetic, the kind of person who seemed invincible. But life doesn't care about invincibility. It doesn't care about past mistakes or old wounds. It just happens. "She's been going through treatment for a while," my daughter continued, "but it's not working. The doctors say she doesn't have much time left." I sat there in silence, the phone pressed to my ear, my mind racing. I didn't know how to feel. Anger, sadness, relief. All of it swirled together in a chaotic mess. "What do you need from me?" I finally asked. "She wants to see you," my daughter said softly. "She says she has things she needs to say." I agreed to meet her, though every fiber of my being screamed not to. We met at a small cafe, the kind of place we used to go to when we were first dating. She looked frail, a shadow of the woman I once knew. Her hair was gone, replaced by a colorful scarf, and her hands trembled as she sipped her tea. For a long time, we just sat there in silence, the weight of everything unsaid hanging between us. Finally, she spoke. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "For everything. I know I hurt you, and I know I can't take it back. But I need you to know that I regret it. every single day. I didn't know what to say. I'd spent years imagining this moment, rehearsing what I'd tell her if I ever got the chance. But now that it was here, all I felt was emptiness. "Why?" I asked. It was the only question that mattered. "Why did you do it?" She looked down at her hands, tears streaming down her face. "I was selfish," she said. "I was scared. I felt like I was losing myself, like I didn't know who I was anymore. And instead of talking to you, instead of trying to fix things, I ran. I ran to someone who made me feel like I mattered. But it was never about him. It was about me." Her words hit me harder than I expected. I'd spent so long blaming her, painting her as the villain in my story, that I'd never stopped to consider her side of things. Not that it excused what she did, but it made her human. Flawed. Just like me. A few weeks after our meeting, my ex-wife passed away. I attended the funeral, standing at the back of the room, feeling like an outsider in my own life. My kids clung to me, their grief raw and overwhelming. And as I stood there, listening to the eulogies, I realized something. I didn't hate her anymore. I didn't love her either. But I understood her, and in some strange way, that felt like closure. But life wasn't done with me yet. A month after the funeral, I received a letter in the mail. It was from my ex-wife, written in her shaky handwriting. She must have mailed it before she died. I opened it with trembling hands, unsure of what to expect. Inside was a confession, not about the affair, I already knew about that, but about something else, something I never saw coming. "There's something I never told you," the letter began. "Our son, he's not yours. I found out during the affair, but I was too scared to tell you. I didn't want to lose you. I didn't want to lose everything." I read the words over and over, my mind refusing to process them. My son, the boy I'd raised, the boy I'd loved as my own, wasn't mine. The revelation shattered me in ways I couldn't explain. But as I sat there, staring at the letter, I realized something. It didn't change how I felt about him. He was still my son, no matter what. Blood didn't define family. Love did. And in that moment, I forgave her. Not because she deserved it, but because I did. I deserved to let go of the anger, the pain, the betrayal. I deserved to move on,